A battlefield is not easy to define. Sometimes it is an open field, sometimes it is a dominant hill, sometimes it is a thick stand of woods, and sometimes it's just a stream meandering wherever the Creator intended it to go. This is one of those streams. Located in northern Virginia, it is called Bull Run. Along its banks occurred the first major battle of the Civil War. A year later, an even greater battle occurred on the same ground. In both instances, Bull Run ran red with the blood of soldiers who were fighting to determine America's destiny. Those soldiers and those battles are our story. For obvious reasons, we call it Bloody Crossroads. The year 1861 began in America with intense anxiety sweeping over the land. 7 states in the Deep South left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, with Mississippian Jefferson Davis as their leader. Meanwhile, American President-elect Abraham Lincoln was stating repeatedly that the Union must be kept intact at whatever cost. In that atmosphere, all eyes slowly shifted to the Commonwealth of Virginia. With more people, more industry, more historic prestige than any other slave state, Virginia was essential to the success of the newly formed Confederacy, just as it had been essential to the new nation in the 1780s. Now, what course Virginia took in 1861 would influence other uncommitted states like North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri. The importance of the Old Dominion and the Secession crisis cannot be overstated. Its historic ties alone were unmatchable. The author of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, the father of his country, Washington, the father of the Constitution, Madison, the greatest Chief Justice, Marshall, all had been Virginians. For more than half the year since the nation began in 1789, someone from Virginia had occupied the presidency. Still, by 1860, the state had cause to sever its ties with what seemed to be an abolitionist-dominated North. In October 1859, an anti-slave fanatic named John Brown led a band of followers in an attack on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown seized the installation, killed several innocent civilians, and called for a slave insurrection to overturn the Southern way of life. His invasion quickly collapsed. Brown was hanged for murder and treason. Yet Virginians ask, how many other John Browns are poised in the North to attack us? Locales throughout the state began organizing military companies. Virginia officials nevertheless sought to effect a compromise in an atmosphere of chaos. Finally, in February 1861, the General Assembly appointed a Virginia Secession Convention. It was to study all the available alternatives open to the state and to make a decision on the feasibility of Virginia joining its sister states in the Confederacy. At the head of the Secession Convention was Leesburg's venerable statesman, John Janney. The elder Janney presided over the daily sessions with the calmness and dignity of the Quaker he was. The convention's first vote was against Virginia leaving the Union. Virginia traditionalists scorned the impetuosity of Southern fire-eaters who wanted to split the nation of the Founding Fathers. Non-slaveholders in Western Virginia balanced the political weight of the planters in the Piedmont and Tidewater. In those first months of 1861, the majority of Virginians still believed, or hoped, that some compromise could cement a shattering Union. It must be remembered that Unionists in Virginia were quite unlike Unionists elsewhere. Virginia Unionists opposed the secession of their state, not secession itself. They preferred to work for a solution to the national problem from within the Union. Secession for them was a last resort measure. However, Virginia Unionists were vigorously opposed to any coercion of the seceded states by the federal government. It all seems clear to you and me today, but one must keep a point ever in mind. Neither North nor South back then really understood the other. Many woeful misassumptions between the two sections had developed in the years leading up to 1861. But the most tragic misunderstanding of all was that each side did not realize until it was too late that the other side was very much in earnest. The talking ended on April 12, when Confederate batteries opened fire on federal-held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. For 33 hours, Southern guns fired over 4,000 rounds at the fort. The small Union garrison, hungry, exhausted, half suffocated, struck its colors. Fort Sumter was the flashpoint of Civil War. The firing on that installation decided that war would determine what words could not cure. On April 15, the day after the surrender of Sumter, Lincoln issued a summons for 75,000 state militia to enter federal service for 90 days in order to put down what the Northern president called an insurrection too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Lincoln's call engendered harmonious units in the North, but it knocked Virginia right out of the Union. People in Richmond were jubilantly celebrating the fall of Fort Sumter when news of Lincoln's call for soldiers came. Virginia's quota was only 2,300 men, the equivalent of 2.5 regiments. Yet this call on the state for soldiers, this obvious, blatantly stated determination by Lincoln to make war, looked to Virginians like flagrant and unbearable coercion. On April 16th, Governor John Letcher, heretofore a moderate politician from Lexington, responded angrily to Lincoln's call. Your object is to subjugate the southern states, and a requisition made upon me for troops for such an object will not be complied with. Letcher added, you have chosen to inaugurate civil war, and having done so, we in Virginia will meet it in a spirit as determined as your administration has exhibited toward the South. On April 17, the convention took another vote. Some delegates individually cast their votes with shouts of happiness and defiance. Other delegates, choking with tears, answered the roll call with barely audible words. The tally was 55 against, 88 for. Virginia no longer belonged to the so-called United States. North and South had come to believe that the central government was a tool of the other side. The democratic process slowly ceased to exist. In 1861, the two sides, each convinced of the evil of the other, stood ready to fight for their country. The politician and the reformer were through. The soldier would now take charge. Virginians, young in spirit and intoxicated with patriotism, rushed to enlist in state units hastily being mobilized. Love of home and family was their major impetus. To defend their native state was their major determination. From the mountains of southwest Virginia to the flatlands of the eastern shore, from Winchester to South Hill, Virginians prepared to fight, to demonstrate to one and all that they loved their country more than they loved their lives. One of those early volunteers was Colonel Robert E. Lee. He resigned from the U.S. Army and accepted the offer to take command of all Virginia forces. Ironically, it was the peace-loving John Janney of Leesburg who welcomed Lee to the packed chamber of the Secession Convention and who wished Lee well in the making of war.
By the end of that spring, Washington, D.C. vibrated with activity. Excitement marked daily life. Streets were filled with rolling stock of every description. Soldiers and civilians jammed the sidewalks. And around the northern capital at night could be seen what a New England matron would call the watchfires of 100 circling camps. Yet the hordes of Union recruits gathering in Washington, attired in every conceivable variety of uniform, were not an army. They were an armed mob of militia, volunteers, and a few companies of regulars. New regiments were arriving every week. It took time to fit them into the shaky military framework. What existed in Washington that spring was an organized mess. It was hardly any better 110 miles away at Richmond. There, a new Confederate government was seeking respectability while its first army formed. To his lasting credit, the officer in charge of Virginia's forces, General Robert E. Lee, put together a heavy force and got it into position at the important rail junction of Manassas. The junction lay only 30 miles south of Washington.
The novelty and unexpectedness of this Civil War was evident in the general selected to command the two field forces. In charge of the main Confederate body at Manassas was General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He thought that Pierre sounded too foreign, so he went by his second name, Gustave. Beauregard was a Louisiana Creole who graduated second in his West Point class. He was a small, graceful officer in his early 40s. He was also a man who wore exquisitely tailored uniforms and kept his gray hair and glossy blackness with liberal applications of dye. Although a well-meaning soldier, Beauregard was egotistical and out of touch with reality. His strategy was always so complex and unworkable that no one ever paid much attention to his ideas. Fortunately for the South that spring, Beauregard was on the defensive. His only duty was to guard the fords across Bull Run and the railroads at Manassas Junction. Across the Blue Ridge in the Shenandoah Valley was a second Confederate force under General Joseph E. Johnston. He and fellow Virginian R.E. Lee had been at West Point together. Johnston was a small, wispy, balding officer, but with the bearing of a professional soldier. Aggressiveness was never in his makeup, and Johnston's self-confidence was such that he reacted angrily to every slight, real or imagined. The Union commander across the way was Irvin McDowell. One of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's favorite staff officers, McDowell had never before led men in battle. Still, Scott elevated him 3 notches from major to brigadier general at one time. Such a promotion did not sit well with all other Union officers standing in line at the seniority ladder. McDowell was a plodding, modest, humorless officer, deaf to suggestions. Maintaining good relationships was not in his makeup. McDowell might have succeeded in spite of it all if he had not lacked one necessary ingredient in war: luck. He was one of those pitiful soldiers born to bad luck. Nothing ever seemed to work for him. McDowell almost made a habit of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory.
In the beginning, both sides expected the Civil War to last no more than 6 months and one battle. Pressure mounted in Washington for McDowell to take his so-called army out to Manassas, do battle against the upstart Southerners there, and bring this civil disturbance to a speedy and victorious end. McDowell knew his brigades were not in good shape, but he was a soldier who always sought to do his duty. Meanwhile, Beauregard learned of Union movements from spies and from Washington newspapers that he received daily. The Southern commander sent a message for Johnston and his men to march quickly from the valley to Manassas. Johnston's Confederates made their way eastward on the overworked Manassas Gap Railroad. By July 20th, 2 of Johnston's 4 brigades had reached Beauregard's line. Some 31,000 Confederates faced 33,000 approaching Federals. Against his better nature, McDowell had departed Washington to do battle. His green force lurched southward in a movement more resembling a mob scene than a military advance. Units bumped into one another or became lost. Officers were as confused as their men. Looting occurred by men who had not yet become soldiers. The Confederates would have been just as disorganized but for one factor. They were on the defensive. They had no long march to make or intricate movement to perform. All they had to do was wait for the enemy to come to them. It took McDowell 4 days to move his force 30 miles. A July 18 probe by Federals at Blackburn's Ford told McDowell that the Confederates were posted behind Bull Run. The Union general dispersed his units along the north bank of the stream.
This is Matthews Hill, one of the high points at Manassas. A mile to the south is Henry House Hill. When Union General McDowell and his forces got to this region, his idea was to send roughly 15,000 men on a flanking march. They would come over here to Matthews Hill, then march southward on the Sudley Springs Road, cross Bull Run, and come in behind the Confederate left flank. It was a well-intentioned plan, but this is early in the war where you're not so much dealing with armies as you are with armed mobs. Things were not going well.
On this knoll was the Van Pelt House, which was commandeered by Colonel Nathan G. Evans as his headquarters. He commanded a small brigade of Confederates guarding the stone bridge on the left flank of the Confederate line. Early in the morning on July 21st, 1861, Union guns on the other side of Bull Run opened fire, and their fire was directed in this vicinity. This opened the First Battle of Manassas. Evans, however, did not return the fire. He kept his troops concealed, except for 2 companies of skirmishers he had sent down along the banks of the stream. Evans did not want to give away his positions nor his relative weakness in this vicinity. But after several hours, Evans realized that the Union Army was not pressing the attack and began to suspect that it might simply be a diversion. Shortly before 9 o'clock that morning, he received a signal message from Captain E.P. Alexander, General Beauregard's signal officer, who was situated some 8 miles to the southeast behind the Confederate left flank. Evans, from that point, learned that the Union Army was shifting troops to the north off his left flank, and he was about to be turned. Evans, without waiting for any further orders from his immediate superiors, left 4 companies of the 4th South Carolina here to guard the bridge, and took the rest of his small brigade, about 900 men, and moved them to the northwest to try to intercept this Union flanking column.
Shanks Evans was a strange figure in an army that would boast of a legion of characters. The South Carolinian was coarse, insubordinate, gruff, anything but a saint. An orderly followed him everywhere, carrying a wooden keg on his back. Evans called it his balalita, and he kept the keg filled with whiskey. He might be, as one of his staff said, the best drinker and most eloquent swearer in the Confederate Army. Yet Evans' stubborn fight early in the day against 10 times his numbers surely sustained the Confederate effort at Manassas.
General McDowell's plan called for Hunter and Heintzelman's divisions to cross Bull Run at dawn, just as General Tyler's guns opened fire at the stone bridge. But delays along the line of march proved costly. The Union forces did not begin to cross Bull Run until 9:30 that morning, long after the sun was high in the sky. And by that time, the Union Army had lost their element of surprise. It was just after 10 o'clock by the time the leading elements of the Union Army reached Matthews Hill. This was the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, part of Burnside's brigade. And they were met by the fire of Evans' skirmishers, which had been deployed on top of this hill. Evans had moved the rest of his line up on the south side of the hill, and as his skirmishers were pushed back, Evans moved up his line. Evans found himself very much outnumbered and outgunned, but he held this ground tenaciously, attacking the Union lines very aggressively, and this bought time for General Beauregard to send reinforcements in this direction.
4 Confederate regiments under Bernard B. and Francis Bartow came to Evans's rescue. And as the fighting continued, Beauregard and Johnston were desperately shifting their forces from the extreme right to the extreme left, a distance of more than 2 miles.
By 11 o'clock, General B's brigade and Colonel Bartow's brigade from the Army of the Shenandoah began to arrive, deploying on Evans' flanks, and together they were able to hold back the Union Army for about another hour. But by 11:30 that morning, the Union Army, in full possession of the top of this hill, had lined up some 20 pieces of artillery, and they pounded the Confederate lines. The Union lines also continued to grow in strength, and by 12 o'clock noon, these lines were beginning to envelop the Confederate positions. The Confederates had suffered very heavy casualties, and they had little choice except to fall back with the Union Army closing in around them.
McDowell should have pressed his advantage. Instead, he halted his men on Matthews Hill, presumably to consolidate his scattered forces. For more than 2 hours, the Federals stood there, and while they did, Confederates massed in their front. Around 2:30 p.m., Federals came off Matthews Hill and advanced in triumphant expectation toward Henry Hill and victory.
About 11:40 that chaotic Sunday morning, an obscure brigadier general arrived here. His name was Jackson, and he was leading 3,000 Confederate soldiers. Jackson reached this point. He immediately saw 3 things. One, this is Henry House Hill. It is the key to the Confederate line because it's the high ground on this part of the battlefield. Secondly, Jackson discerned he has to stabilize the ever-fluctuating Confederate line. This was the place to do it. Thirdly, he determined to put his men not up on the hilltop where they would be subjected to Federal fire, but on the reverse slope, the down slope on the opposite side of the hill from the Federal side. He placed his guns on top, and for about 2 hours and 40 minutes, Confederate artillery pieces dueled with Federal cannon across the way. Meanwhile, Jackson's men behind the guns were lying down in this kind of discarded pasture land of waist-high grass and young saplings. They took a lot of incoming fire. Some of them were able to take refuge in the wood line to the south, but most of them lay out here in the open. And the time passed very, very slowly. Finally, in mid-afternoon, the great long-expected Federal assault up Henry House Hill began. It was the moment Jackson had been awaiting.
About 1:30 in the afternoon, Captain James B. Ricketts, commanding Company I of the 1st U.S. Artillery, was ordered forward to Henry Hill in pursuit of what they thought was a retreating enemy. However, when Captain Ricketts got on the hill with his battery, he found himself confronted by a line of Confederate artillery no more than 300 yards away on the other side of this plateau. The Confederates quickly got the range, and they subjected Ricketts and his gunners to quite a bit of lead and iron. Ricketts initially found his battery unsupported. It was a good 20 minutes before the 1st Union Infantry arrived to his support. This was the 11th New York Volunteer Infantry, better known as the Fire Zouaves. They came up the hill in good order, but did not linger very long on top of this hill. They soon fell back to the Sedley Road, leaving Ricketts' guns very much exposed and very much vulnerable to attack. It was not long after this that a massive wave of Confederate infantry came swarming across the field, through the tall grass and through the smoke, all screaming and yelling what would soon become known as the Rebel Yell. Ricketts' guns were quickly overrun. Ricketts was wounded in the attack. Union reinforcements, however, came up the hill and pushed the Confederates back. The fighting went back and forth across these fields from the rest of the afternoon. Ricketts' battery changed hands at least 3 times in the process.
Southern General Bernard Bee, trying to organize his broken lines, saw some Confederates in position behind the slope. Bee galloped to that point where he met an old West Point friend, Thomas Jackson. The calm Jackson was at the head of 5 regiments of fresh Virginia infantry, plus a battery of guns. Jackson reassured Bee that he would give support. Bee rode back down through the smoke to his mass of stragglers. Standing in the saddle, waving his sword toward the hilltop, Bee shouted, "Look, men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." Bee would fall mortally wounded moments later, but many of his men hearkened to the appeal. His words also gave birth to the most famous nickname in American military history. Stonewall Jackson lived up to the new title at once. His soldiers met the Federals with a fire that shredded the infantry and devastated Ricketts' supporting Union battery.
Here on the farm of Benjamin Chinn, west of Henry Hill, is where the action at the First Battle of Manassas ended. Howard's brigade, the last fresh Union brigade arriving from Sudley Springs Ford, came up here around 4 o'clock in the afternoon and attempted to get around the Confederate lines on Henry Hill. However, he was met by Elzey's brigade in front and Jubal Early's brigade in the flank, and his line soon crumbled. The panic among his troops soon spread to other Union forces, and by 4:30 in the afternoon, the whole Union Army was in full retreat.
Northern recruits, in battle for the better part of 7 hours, had simply been used beyond their capacity. They fell back, and McDowell's force began retiring across Bull Run. Exhausted Union soldiers encountered hundreds of excited Washington civilians who had come out for a Sunday picnic and to watch the Civil War end. Now, everyone decided it was time to go. Carriages and buggies swarmed onto the roads that Union men and equipment were also trying to use. A massive traffic jam materialized, and when a Confederate artillery shell blew up a bridge across Club Run, blocking the main highway completely, unadulterated panic erupted. Soldiers and civilians began running toward Washington. By sundown, complete chaos had spilled over the landscape.
A number of Civil War notables gained fame in this first major engagement. At the top was the man of the hour, Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And often from the mountains of northwestern Virginia and hero in the Mexican War, Jackson had spent the 1850s as an introverted, somewhat eccentric, and not always effective college professor at the Virginia Military Institute. That he possessed attributes of a military genius was a surprise to almost everyone at this opening stage of the war. Yet starting with his conduct atop Henry Hill, Jackson's name would become a household word in the South, as well as a feared spirit in parts of the North. Southern cavalry under Jeb Stuart helped blunt the main Union assault, and infantry under Jubal Early were part of the force that broke the Federal flank and ensured Confederate success. Both men would subsequently have sterling careers. The battle also brought reputations to several Union officers. Poor McDowell became the scapegoat and was ingloriously dumped from Army command. However, many of his lieutenants performed well that day. Ambrose Burnside, later a commander of that Union Army, led a Rhode Island brigade in the turning movement on the Confederate left, and Burnside displayed gallant behavior. Joseph Hooker, who also would attain Army command, was conspicuous on the battlefield. Oliver O. Howard, James Ricketts, Fitzjohn Porter, and William B. Franklin would fare well at Manassas and ultimately achieve corps commands. Another, less prominent figure in the battle was a 41-year-old Ohio colonel named William T. Sherman. His dislike of volunteer soldiers, his conviction that the Civil War was going to be long and exceedingly bloody, and his open humiliation at what happened at Manassas took Sherman to the edge of a nervous breakdown. As he slowly gained composure, Sherman developed a cold-hearted attitude toward warfare. In time, he became the personification of war in its most destructive form. This opening engagement at Manassas ended with 4,600 men killed, wounded, and captured. By the bloody standards of later battles, these losses were not excessive, nor were they light. And considering that for 7 hours, men poorly trained and ignorant of war performed as well as they did, will forever be a monument to American determination and courage. First Manassas, or First Bull Run as it is called in the North, established a number of precedents. Among them, railroads played a vital role in both military strategy and tactics. Using flags for wigwag communications assumed new sophistication. The urgent need for vast improvement in field medicine became painfully evident. The South deluded itself into thinking that victory at Manassas meant the end of the war. One Confederate soldier told his wife, "Sunday last was the happiest day of my life, our wedding day not excepted. I think the fight is over forever." Lethargy descended over the Confederacy. The North was not going to see the Union end so easily. It began mobilizing for a new war, a higher conflict, costlier and more awful than anything the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. What happened at the bloody Crossroads of Manassas in July 1861 was but the curtain raiser, the overture, a terrible ordeal for a young nation at war with itself to determine what the future of America should be. At this opening battle of the Civil War, one might expect that every commander on the field would make mistakes. One did not. The improbable hero of this battle was a shy, reticent, humorless ex-professor, a man full of ferocious Presbyterianism, but a soldier born to fight. And on July 21st, 1861, here at Manassas, he got an immortal nickname and was known thereafter as Stonewall Jackson.
After the July debacle at Manassas, the Lincoln government moved quickly to pick up the pieces and start anew. The hapless McDowell suffered demotion to division level. His replacement at the top was General George B. McClellan. This 34-year-old officer was an organizer and a perfectionist, which meant that he would never be quite ready to fight. McClellan spent the fall and winter of 1861-1862 building America's largest army. Under direct orders from Lincoln, McClellan transferred the 150,000 men in his Army of the Potomac to the tip of the Virginia Peninsula and began a slow westward advance on Richmond. Confederate General Joseph Johnston retreated in the face of McClellan's march. Union forces got to within 9 miles of the Confederate capital before Johnston turned and attacked. The Battle of Seven Pines halted McClellan's offensive. Johnston fell wounded in the action and was replaced by President Davis's military advisor, General Robert E. Lee. While McClellan was inching his way toward Richmond, General Stonewall Jackson was winning international fame in the Shenandoah Valley. Outnumbered as much as 4-1, Jackson conducted a brilliant campaign that sent 3 separate Union forces in retreat and cleared the valley of Federal soldiers. Lee then summoned Jackson's troops to the Richmond area for a counteroffensive against McClellan's army. In what became known as the 7 Days Campaign, Lee drove the Union Army to the banks of the James River. For the moment, Richmond was safe. A new threat suddenly materialized for Lee when a second Federal army started southward from Washington. Lincoln had taken the 3 damaged commands in the Shenandoah Valley and combined them into a single force. Some 55,000 soldiers under General John Pope planned to march south through the Piedmont to the Charlottesville area, then turn east and strike for Richmond. Once again, a real danger loomed for Virginia and the Confederacy.
The Union Army of Virginia was an unnatural entity that never had the basic solidarity of an army. Shakiness started with its leader. John Pope was a native of Louisville, Kentucky, a collateral descendant of George Washington, a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. Pope was also bombastic, vain, obnoxious. Not only was Pope the most despised field commander in the Union Army, he holds the distinction of being the only Union officer for whom Lee displayed open contempt. Pope's problem from start to end of this campaign was that he was never quite sure where his army was, and he did not have the faintest idea where the enemy was. The Army of Virginia was actually a loose confederation of 3 different forces. All were poorly led. Worse, all were accustomed to defeat. Commanding the 3 corps were Generals Franz Sigel, Nathaniel Banks, and Irvin McDowell. 2 of them should have been back in civilian life, and the 3rd had neither the charisma to make men respond nor the luck to win a victory.
Lee could not leave the Richmond front as long as McClellan's army was still on the peninsula. To stall Pope's advance, Lee dispatched Jackson and 24,000 men to the Central Virginia Rail Junction at Gordonsville. On August 9th, Jackson confronted 2 advancing Union divisions of Pope's army at Cedar Mountain, south of Culpeper. For the first hours, outnumbered Federals actually crashed through part of the Confederate line. The arrival of Southern reinforcements enabled Jackson to win a decisive victory.
By then, it was obvious to Lee that McClellan was abandoning the peninsula. So the Confederate commander took his 30,000 soldiers and joined Jackson. The idea was to destroy Pope before McClellan and his Army of the Potomac could reinforce him. Lee was not looking merely for a tactical advantage. The Southern vision of independence was coming into focus. Defeating Pope and McClellan might bring final victory. Toward that end, Lee was willing to take enormous chances. In the 3rd week of August, Lee made a bold move. He split his army in half. While General James Longstreet's portion held Pope's attention along the Rappahannock River, Jackson's 3 veteran divisions would march off to the northwest, away from Pope's position. Once out of sight, Jackson would circle behind Bull Run Mountains, pass east through Thoroughfare Gap, and strike somewhere behind Pope's army. The 2 halves of the Army of Northern Virginia would respond to whatever strategic opportunities the situation presented. In due time, Lee would combine his forces to finish off Pope. The most anxious moment for Jackson on the march around Pope's army came here. Behind me is a long north-south ridge, heavily wooded, known as Bull Run Mountains. Through it was one narrow gash, called Thoroughfare Gap. Jackson had every reason to believe that Federals would be defending that gap on August 26. Incredibly enough, none were there. Jackson's foot cavalry poured through the gap out onto the plains of Manassas beyond and headed unimpeded toward Pope's great supply depot at Manassas Junction. 2 days later, James Longstreet's men would come along the same road, approaching Thoroughfare Gap. However, they were not as fortunate. Jackson's so-called foot cavalry made an astounding march, 56 miles in 34 hours. Confederates struck the Orange and Alexandria Railroad 20 miles behind Pope's army, then marched 8 miles down the line and destroyed the main Union supply depot at Manassas Junction. The weariness and lethargy that had made Jackson a disappointment on the peninsula were gone. Now he was the Jackson of the Valley, a panther, swift and deadly. An angry and somewhat bewildered Pope retired from the Rappahannock line and started north to bag Jackson with a force now increased to 66,000 soldiers. Outnumbering Jackson by 3-to-1 odds, Pope declared that he would bag the whole crowd of impotent rebels the next day. Jackson's responsibility at that point was to pin down the Federals on some good fighting ground and hold Pope long enough for Lee to come up with Longstreet's soldiers. Pope advanced toward Manassas with the thought that he was casting a net. Actually, Pope was walking straight into one.
We are situated at the eastern approaches to Thoroughfare Gap. Just behind me are the ruins of Chapman's Mill, which stood here at the time of the Civil War. Also in the gap is a stream known as Broad Run. There was also the railroad, the Manassas Gap Railroad, and a road. Today there are 2 roads, and you can probably hear the rumble of vehicles on Interstate 66 as we speak. Ricketts' division was sent to block this gap on the 28th of August, 1862, hoping to prevent Longstreet from reaching Jackson, who was thought to be at Manassas Junction. Ricketts, however, found himself confronting Longstreet's troops at this point, and a bitter contest for the gap soon resulted. Just behind Chapman's Mill, there's a large quarry trench which extends about 100 yards up the mountainside on Mother Leathercoat Mountain on the north side of the gap. And on either side of this quarry trench, the 11th Pennsylvania and the 1st Georgia Regulars confronted each other. One member of the 1st Georgia Regulars said it was like fighting on the roof of a house. After about an hour of this intense fighting, the 9th Georgia regained possession of Chapman's Mill. Eventually, General Ricketts, sensing that he was being pressured on his flanks, withdrew from the gap, and by nightfall, the Confederates under Longstreet had won possession of the gap. The following day, they would have a clear road to join the forces under General Jackson on the plains of Manassas.
Through the morning and early afternoon of August 28th, Pope issued contradictory and confusing orders in his frantic search to find Jackson. Meanwhile, Stonewall had found a good defensive spot on the Bronner farm. His men occupied a heavily wooded ridge 1,000 yards north of the Warrenton Turnpike and near the old Manassas battlefield. The turnpike was Pope's main avenue of march. Near 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Federal columns started past Jackson's position. A 2nd Union division was passing the Bronner farm when Jackson ordered a surprise attack.
This little-known fight at Bronner's farm, or Groveton as it is often called, was vicious and hideous. General Richard Ewell, Jackson's senior division chief, lost a leg in the battle, as well as his effectiveness thereafter as a field commander. At Bronner's farm, Jackson's famous unit, the Stonewall Brigade, came literally face-to-face with his Union counterpart, the Iron Brigade from the Midwest. The 2 forces stood in the open, no more than 80 yards apart, and shot it out, as if combat was supposed to be waged in such primitive fashion. Both brigades lost a third of their numbers that day. A Union soldier was stunned by the intensity of the fighting. Men standing at arm's length, he said, giving and taking, life for life, ceasing action from sheer exhaustion, which was complete upon one side as upon the other. Another Billy Yank thought the Bonner Farm engagement a mixture of earthquake, volcano, thunderstorm, and cyclone. The battle noise might have been a tune for demons to dance to. The 4 hours of fighting produced 2,400 casualties. Neither side gave ground. As one Confederate general noted, it was a question of endurance, and both endured. Such fury took place near the community of Groveton. Little exists today of Groveton except for a small cemetery. The biggest byproduct of war is so often the easiest to forget: the dead. The victorious North buried most of its soldiers who slain in battle in national cemeteries which dot our land. Disposition of the Confederate dead, however, was left to individual and local efforts. This cemetery stands on the Second Manassas battlefield. Established in great part by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it contains the bodies of at least 266 and perhaps as many as 500 Confederate soldiers. The vast majority of them are unknown. With this cemetery only yards away from the ever-busy Warrington Turnpike, one has to conclude that these men hardly sleep in peace. Pope and Jackson now knew where the other was. Jackson shifted his men a quarter mile to a new and stronger point to await a full Union attack. The countryside was familiar to Jackson. A year earlier, on ground a few hundred yards to the east, he had won fame and a nickname. Yet the challenge he faced now was far more Herculean. For the Second Battle of Manassas, Jackson put more than 20,000 men in place. Along most of his 2-mile front was the line of an unfinished railroad with its cuts and fills and embankments. Behind the line was a wooded ridge that offered Confederate artillery an excellent field of fire. In short, this was an ideal position for a defensive fight. It was made to order for a tough force of Confederates whose sole function was to hold their line while awaiting reinforcements, and whose commander was a man named Stonewall.
On August 29th, Pope went into battle with little delay and less surveillance. He simply ordered 11,000 soldiers in a headlong assault on Jackson's center. Northern troops advanced through a killing storm of Confederate musketry and artillery fire. Union lines fractured, drifted apart, then came back together in a renewed attack. Jackson's lines held. Pope next dispatched 12,000 seasoned fighters under Generals Hooker, Burnside, and Philip Kearny on a massive assault against Jackson's left flank. 6 times Federals attacked in piecemeal fashion. 6 times they were driven back with heavy losses. Fighting died down with the coming of darkness. Meanwhile, the other half of Lee's army, 30,000 Confederates under Longstreet, had quietly moved into position on Jackson's right. The new wave of attacks on Jackson struck so hard that for a short time it looked as if Pope might carry the day in spite of his mishandling. In some places, hand-to-hand fighting took place. When Jackson's brigade of Louisianians ran out of ammunition, they hurled stones to blunt the Union onslaught.
The deepest point in the unfinished railroad was called Deep Cut. Posted there on August 30th was the 42nd Virginia, hardy farm boys from the counties of Roanoke, Bedford, Campbell, Floyd, Henry, and Patrick. In command of the regiment that day was 27-year-old Captain Robert Withers of Rustburg. General Jackson stated on more than one occasion that while his soldiers sometimes failed to capture a position, they never failed to hold one. Here at Manassas, the men of the 42nd Virginia gave weight to Jackson's words.
In mid-afternoon, the hard-pressed Jackson did what he scarcely ever did. He asked Lee for help. Lee responded by sending Longstreet's men forward against the naked left flank of Pope's army. The Manassas battleground suddenly doubled in size to 3 miles in length. Some 30,000 fresh, confident, and enthusiastic Confederates swept eastward along the Warrington Turnpike, overwhelming every Federal unit in their path. A soldier in the midst of the action noted, "A gigantic tumult of musketry filled the air, and Federals and Confederates exchanged long, crashing volleys at close range. Jackson's men burned the slope with rifle fire, and on a hill to the southwest, new batteries unlimbered and let loose a deadly enfilade fire that cut the support lines to pieces and left the Federal advance isolated and helpless.
One of the most colorful units in all the Union armies had to be the 5th New York Infantry, known as the Durée Zouaves because of its uniform, which consisted of bright red baggy trousers, white canvas leggings, and blue jacket. That uniform played against it on the afternoon of August 30th. The 5th New York was stationed here on high ground when suddenly Hood's Texas Brigade came out of the woods and delivered a murderous fire into the New Yorkers, who were basically silhouetted against the sky. The New Yorkers could not respond because Union fugitives were coming in advance of the Confederates themselves. And so, according to one soldier, the New Yorkers stood like statues while the Texans delivered point-blank musketry at them. The regiment went into action that afternoon with 490 men. 70% of them were casualties. It suffered 124 dead, which is the highest number of men in a single unit killed in a single engagement during the entire war.
Pope's line now began to curl, and in places it seemed ready to crumble. While Pope worked frantically to get reinforcements over on his shattered left, other Federal regiments made a stand on high ground at Gin Ridge. If the Confederates could take the next ridge, Henry Hill of 1861 fame, this second battle might bring the total destruction of Pope's army. However, Pope had used the time during the Gin Ridge fighting to rush troops to the threatened area. As the sun was setting, Longstreet's men made a brief, weak lunge at Henry Hill. Slowly, painfully, the battle sputtered out in the twilight. Under cover of darkness and a rainstorm, Pope led his defeated army in retreat toward Washington.
These boulders were the first attempt to mark the site of the Battle of Chantilly, which is not well known, but it should be. Here on September 1, 1862, General Jackson attempted once again to flank Pope's army, which was retreating from 2nd Manassas. Here in the afternoon, a battle broke out. Jackson caught up with the rear of the Union army. He stopped, decided to wait, but the Union armies across the way decided instead to attack. And the first attack came here, at Ox Hill, as it's sometimes called, Chantilly, as it's best remembered. General Isaac Stevens, a feisty little commander, barely 5 feet tall, led the first attack with his division against Jackson's line. In very rapid fashion, 5 color bearers went down. Stevens dismounted from his horse, grabbed the flag, hollered, "Follow me, boys, follow your general," and he led them forward and himself was killed. The second attack came from the other Union division under New Jersey's most distinguished soldier, General Philip Kearny, who had lost an arm in the Mexican War. As Kearny's men started forward, a torrential rainstorm began. Driving rain, accelerated by gusty winds, made visibility practically zero. Kearny's men fared no better. Indeed, Kearny himself, in all the confusion and lack of visibility, rode into the Confederate lines and was himself killed. After about 2 hours, the two sides broke off, thanks in large part to weather, and the Battle of Chantilly ended. The Battle of Chantilly cost 1,500 casualties, including 2 of the Union's finer generals, Stevens and Kearny. Today, very little is remembered about the battlefield, namely because there is no battlefield, thanks to the greed of developers and the short-sightedness of county governments. It is often said that those who forget history are condemned to relive it. The Battle of Chantilly deserves a better fate than this small plot of ground. Never again would Lee come as close to destroying a Union army as he did with Pope at 2nd Manassas. Morale in the North plunged with news of the Union defeat. A New York City woman exclaimed, "I feel ashamed of being an American now. To think that we should be conquered by the bare feet and rags of the South." Union General John Sedgwick was convinced that the division of America into 2 nations was certain. The only question, Sedgwick added, is where the line is to run. This second battle along Bull Run basically ended the military career of Pope, Fitzjohn Porter, and Irvin McDowell. Lincoln had no choice but to give overall Army command back to George McClellan and hope for the best. To the south, the campaign had lifted the Confederacy's fortunes from the edge of disaster in June to near independence by late August. Second Manassas effectively cleared Virginia of any major federal threat. Lee now saw the opportunity to take the Civil War into the north. A successful invasion and a victory on northern soil might well bring an end to the war and sovereignty to the south. Confederates marched away from the bloody Crossroads at Manassas. On September 4, 1862, Lee's army left Virginia's soil and splashed across the Potomac River. But that is another story. I'm standing in the middle of the Manassas National Battlefield Park, and obviously we have some distractions. Behind me is the Stone House, one of only two structures still standing from the battles of 1st and 2nd Manassas. It was a field hospital in both engagements. And yet the front of the structure, that is to say its yard, is in danger from the ever-increasing demands of traffic and modern society, one can say. Please join me now as we go inside the Stone House to talk with National Park Service historian James Burgess about the problems that exist here at Manassas. We are inside the Stone House, where the wounded of two battles suffered and scores of them died. Yet a few yards away, the traffic is always present, and it does much to distract the respect we should feel here. Local governments in Northern Virginia say much about the ongoing battle between progress and history. I think that's misleading. Building one strip mall within walking distance of another is hardly progress. The real battle here in Northern Virginia is development versus respect for the past. And no battlefield in the National Park Service system has been more under fire and more under pressure than Manassas. Mr. Burgess, just what are the problems here at the moment?
Well, Manassas has been under a great deal of pressure over many years, as you say, from commercial as well as residential development. Prince William County is one of the fastest growing counties in Northern Virginia. And this has put a great deal of pressure on the park, especially in terms of traffic. Local politicians have been fighting to widen the two highways that transect the park for many years, and the park has resisted any attempts to see these roads widened.
Do you see the park actually losing ground in the foreseeable future?
The park is under a great deal of pressure from the local Congressman Wolf, to get these roads widened. And even though the Park Service is really only the caretaker for this ground, we don't actually own the ground, it belongs to all the people of the United States. This one congressman seems intent upon forcing the Park Service to give up land it really doesn't own. It's land that belongs to all the people.
On this ground were fought not one but two major battles of the Civil War. It just seems almost shameful to think that some of it would be bulldozed.
It is hallowed ground, no question about it. When these roads were widened, there were bodies found, graves from the Civil War. Men were buried almost anywhere and everywhere, usually where they fell, and many were never recovered after the war, and they're still out there. And
what can the average person do to try and preserve it?
Well, it takes an act of Congress to establish a park. It should take also an act of Congress to give up land from a park. If Congress sees fit to give land to the state to widen the roads, so be it. But if enough people protest this to their congressmen, perhaps congressmen can prevent this desecration of hallowed ground.